Hi, I'm Carl Ide, instructor of sociology. In this short video, we'll be looking at three macro-sociological dynamics in the United States that can help us to better understand racial economic inequalities. First, we'll be looking at rates of employment and unemployment. Then we'll be turning to income, which is what we often think about when we think about economic inequalities. But finally, we'll look at family-based wealth inequalities. Now, this is often overlooked, but it's an important measure and an increasingly important measure in understanding life chances and economic outcomes, and we can look at how these have varied by racial groups historically and how that historic trends have carried into today. Thanks.
A highly persistent finding sociologically of black unemployment typically being about twice that of white unemployment. Actually, back in 1962, it was even higher. Remember, that was when discrimination was overt and legal. Since we changed the law, it actually got much less and then sort of spiked as the economy has changed, but it's typically been around twice as high. There's also income inequality. The takeaway there is that there's remained a significant amount of income inequality since back in the 50s when these measures started getting taken, with white workers just making a lot more money than everyone else. The only exception to that is Asian American men, who recently have started making more than white men. But that's only the case when you look at people with really high levels of education. Asian American men do tend to go into very highly paid, skilled jobs at that level of education, but Asian American men who have a bachelor's still make significantly less than white men with a bachelor's. So we have things sort of moving around with income inequality, but the level of inequality has remained relatively stable since the civil rights movement. And there's an idea out there that things just get better every single year, but when it comes to these metrics here, they've been remarkably stable since the civil rights movement. We haven't made a lot of progress on income inequality or on wealth inequality, and this will be the last things that we explore. If we go back to the 60s, all the way until today, white families have had between 8 and 13 times the amount of wealth as do black families. So what is wealth? How is wealth different from income? It moves down, it compounds, it gets larger. Included in wealth is your home, the value and equity in your home, which we know have had a very unequal racial history. And wealth is more important in terms of outcomes than income. If you compare people across different levels of wealth, the inequalities are much greater than just looking at income. If you have a high income, but you get laid off and you don't have any wealth, you're still not in a great situation. Whereas if you have a lot of wealth, if your family has a lot of wealth, then even if you're laid off through market fluctuations or whatever, you can weather that storm very easily. So, while there are white families that have no wealth, while there are some black families that have a lot of wealth, the overall difference has been 8 to 13 times, and that has also been relatively stable, and around 10 times more wealth, non-Hispanic whites than Hispanic people on average. I found this from Forbes magazine. So this breaks down the wealth difference in a way that I find interesting, because what these charts do is, if this line right here is $100 that's owned by white families on average, this little symbol here is what people, when they're surveyed, how much wealth they think black families have compared to white families. And this dot here is how much wealth black families actually have compared to white families. So we see two completely different trends happening here. Back in 1963, again, before the Civil Rights Act, when discrimination was perfectly legal, people believed that black families had a little under half the amount of wealth that white families did. Now this was like way off because we see that black families had closer to 5% as much wealth, but that's the closest that we've ever been as far as our perceptions to the reality. This jumps all the way ahead to 1983, and what we see from 1983 every 2 years up to 2016 is the belief that we're inching toward equality. All the way here at 2016, people believe, when surveyed, that black family and white families have almost the exact same amount of wealth, that there's really not a problem, and that it's sort of naturally getting better. But the reality is very different from that. The reality is that black wealth compared to white wealth actually peaked in the 1990s and has been going down, but has never been more than, generously, I would say 20%. Generously, I would say 20%. But at that same time, people thought that it was close to 80%. So even though we have those data, even though we know that at the level of the society, that's what's happening, a lot of people, especially people who benefit from the system, just don't believe that it's happening. So it goes back to a question of how do you fix a problem if no one believes that there's a problem? So it's like your doctor says that you have a really high blood sugar level, and your doctor's the one that has the tests. Your doctor's the one that has the data, like the data that can show that there's this inequality here, but you just don't believe that it's happening. If you refuse to believe the data and you go home and have a Snickers and have a stroke, it's somewhat similar. You won't fix a problem if you don't believe it's there. And if you don't trust the data and you just refuse to see it, then any attempt to try and fix the problem looks like just crazy talk. It looks like just someone trying to tell you what to do when there's not a problem at all. But the more data that we amass, the more that we see that these problems are real and they're persistent, and they're not new. In fact, we can draw very clear lines between the situations today, which in some cases have gotten much better. In wealth, it hasn't really since the 60s. In some cases, some things have gotten much better. Graduation rates have gotten better. There's less inequality. Life expectancy has gotten better. There's less inequality. But there are other areas where we have these highly persistent and dramatic inequalities, like in wealth, but we can't politically figure out how to do anything about it. This chart here is saying that people who tend to overestimate how much wealth black families have compared to white families also tend to believe in meritocracy. So what is meritocracy? It's like you work hard and you're smart and you'll make it. Well, people who endorse that view, people who really think that that view is there, people who think there's not discrimination, are much more likely than are others to say, well, there's really not a problem. They're much more likely to overestimate how much wealth black families have and underestimate the inequality.
To briefly review, racial economic inequalities are a persistent fact of American life that we can see more clearly when we look at macro-level statistical data on employment, income, and wealth inequalities across different racial groups. Many people in the United States believe that these types of inequalities are growing smaller each year and tend to downplay the significance of these inequalities in shaping the lives and opportunities of families and individuals from different racial categories. This is especially strong among those who believe in meritocracy. The problem here is that we must first recognize the inequality if we want to address it. This concludes our lecture on economic inequalities, focusing on employment, income, and wealth inequalities across racial groups. Thanks so much.